uh, Dr. Michael Lawrence, who's giving us, in fact, the privilege to be with us today, directly from Canada. So for Michael, it's extremely early. So it's very we even more appreciate, in fact, your presence amongst us cybernetically. So my name is Sebastian Norbert. I'm with my colleagues Laura Considine and J.S. Coram, one of the co-leads for the Polycrisis network. And today we have, in fact, the chance to have with us Michael Lawrence. So for those who maybe have time to read the short bio, Michael is at the moment a research fellow at the Cascade Institute and works on the Polycrisis program, which is related to the Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. But Michael has the chance to live on the east of the country. His work examines, in fact, the causal mechanisms of crises interaction across systems of global governance, which involves, in fact, energy, food, economy, climate, ecology, and obviously international security. So he has developed, in fact, the website polycrisis.org, and that's, amongst people, I think working on Polycrisis is quite an important site to find out who works on the topic, which is obviously at the Cascade Institute. And in fact, he is also one of the, I would say, co-editor on the special edition of Polycrisis and Anthropocene of the journal Global Sustainability, which I recommend people to read. A very interesting read. He got his PhD in global governance from the Basili School in International Affairs at the University of Waterloo in Canada, which is in Ontario. His dissertation used complex system thinking to trace, in fact, the co-evolution of the world order and violent conflict, and builds also the long-standing work in the field of peace, conflict, and security studies, globalization and global governance, world history and political economy. So obviously, for colleagues from Polis, I think Michael's work resonates here very well. So and his research interests and publication are wide-ranging and includes more or less societal collapse, state building and state formation, international peace operations, the psychology of mass violence, transnational organized crime, social ontology, and application of complexity thinking in the social sciences. He also teaches at the University of Waterloo on complex system approaches to global governance, foreign policy, and conflict resolution. And obviously, he has also constructed course at the University of Toronto on culture and human security, and on the interaction of art, history, and the politics of the 20th century at Berlin. So his other professional experiences also include work with the Colombian campaign against landmines, the Center for International Governance Innovation and Security Governance Group. So, Michael, it's all a pleasure to have you with us. And now, you have 30 to 40 minutes in front of us to give us your talk.
Great. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for that wonderful long introduction there. It's really a pleasure to be here and make this connection to the University of Leeds and to the Polycrisis network there. I hope one day I'll be able to visit you in person, but for now, it'll just have to be online. So at the first webinar about 2 weeks ago, Olivier Boraz gave us this really great presentation on polycrisis as organizational crisis. And today I want to present what I think is a different but very much complementary perspective on polycrisis as multi-systemic crisis. I'm going to try and emphasize the need for better systemic thinking on polycrisis, and I want to show you some of the systemic approaches that we've developed at the Cascade Institute. I'm going to make a caveat right away that we've developed our own particular systemic approaches to polycrisis that we think have been very, very productive. But what I'm going to present to you today is really just one way you could apply systems thinking to the polycrisis approach. There are lots of different possibilities. This is just one that we've worked pretty hard on and are pretty happy with, but it's certainly not the definitive systems approach to polycrisis. There's still lots and lots of theoretical room to be explored here. But before I actually get into systems thinking and to our approaches, I just want to take a few minutes to think about why the term polycrisis has become so popular in the last few years. People are using this term more and more, but they seem to be using it to mean different things, using it in different ways, using it with different definitions. But amidst all this sort of buzzword popularity, I think there are still a few common threads that are drawing more and more people towards this particular concept, and which ultimately signal the need for new and better systemic thinking. So first and foremost, I think the term polycrisis reflects a widespread sense that everything in the world is going wrong at the same time. A lot of people like to talk about a perfect storm of problems, but that's really not a good metaphor because it implies that the coincidence of our problems is really just that, just a coincidence or just bad luck. If our luck changed, our problems might go away. But I think when people use the term polycrisis, they have this deeper instinct that these problems are very densely interconnected, sometimes in hidden ways that we don't understand. So crises in the world are not just simultaneous, they are interacting. We're not in a perfect storm, we're in a polycrisis. And second, I think a lot of people are drawn to this term polycrisis because they have a sense that humanity is in a truly unprecedented situation. We've undoubtedly faced multiple intersecting crises or polycrises in the past. So, for example, the Second World War or the 1970s OPEC oil crisis, they would both qualify as polycrises or multiple intersecting crises. But I think the present global polycrisis has a few features that really are unprecedented and which are especially precarious in what is sort of a break from the past, something unique. And those characteristics are really concerning the extent to which human activities are forcing the climate and ecosystems well beyond safe operating boundaries like never before in human history. We also have to consider that the density and the rapidity of global interconnection among the human population is at its highest level among a human population that's at its highest level in all human history. And we have to also consider the exponential growth in our technological capabilities, including all the new bright, shiny new ways we have of destroying ourselves. These are things that I think make the present global polycrisis different from the past. And I'd say we really are in an unprecedented predicament, and that's key to why a lot of people are turning to new language. And third, and this really follows the thinking of Adam Tooze, a lot of people use the term polycrisis to highlight the lack of a single root cause to our problems. We can't just reduce everything that's going wrong in the world to, say, capitalism or inequality or climate change or nuclear weapons or this global conspiracy or that global conspiracy. In reality, our problems arise from myriad causes that are interacting in very, very complex global systems that take on a life of their own. And of course, if our problems truly are complex and systemic, solutions aimed at a single cause are just not going to work. They're much more likely to make things worse. And fourth, I think that the popularity of the term polycrisis, but other terms as well, like permacrisis or metacrisis, they indicate that we're struggling at a very fundamental level to understand the mess that we're in. The term polycrisis really inherently reflects a condition of deep uncertainty over where the world is and where we're going. It signals that old concepts are inadequate and people are really looking for new ways of thinking about our problems and new ways of thinking about possible solutions or possible strategies and actions. And finally, I think a key part of the whole polycrisis discussion is really this widespread agreement that the siloing of academic disciplines and policymaking agencies into just very, very narrow, specific, barricaded issue areas, well, that represents a major and continuing impediment to effective responses to polycrisis. Our institutions are really designed to consider separable individual threats, but not complex interacting ones. So as Olivier Boras nicely explained in the last webinar, polycrises are organizational crises, especially in the sense that organizational dysfunctions become a key dynamic or a key component of polycrisis. And so for me, the implication of these 5 points is actually relatively straightforward. That's that right now, humanity's problems are complex and systemic in nature. If we're actually going to understand and address them, we need to apply multidisciplinary complex systems thinking. And with that in mind, I'm going to present to you today the systems thinking approach that we've developed at the Cascade Institute, which we hope will help us all better understand and address the polycrisis. So in the definition we've developed, polycrisis is first and foremost about systems that go into crisis in ways that create real harms. The central referent of our analytical framework is systems, and it's about causal linkages across different systems. Now, it's important to note that a polycrisis can occur at any scale, whether that's local or national or global, as long as that scale hosts interacting systems that can get entangled in their problems. But at the Cascade Institute, we've been very specifically concerned about polycrisis at the global scale. And we've identified 8 global systems that we think can get entangled in contemporary polycrisis, and to various extents are entangled in the contemporary global polycrisis. They're represented here in just what we call the octagon, which is just a little heuristic diagram that's served us well. Now, with this definition of polycrisis, we're really trying to emphasize a couple features of polycrisis. First is this idea of emergent harms. That's the idea that the interactions between constituent crises are significant enough to produce harms that are both different than and generally greater than the sum of the harms those crises would produce separately. When these things happen together, the impacts are much different and much worse than they would be if they had happened apart. Facing the geopolitical crisis in Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the midst of a pandemic crisis and its economic fallout, well, that's been a lot different than we could imagine had those crises occurred separately. And just want to stress that what might appear to be separate crises in different systems, in fact, in many cases, exacerbate and reshape one another to form this conjoined polycrisis that really has to be understood and addressed as a whole, not in a piecemeal fashion. So based on this definition and the approach behind it, our theoretical framework for polycrisis analysis has 2 major parts. The first is a model of systemic crisis in a single system that we call the stress trigger crisis model, or STC model. And second is what we call a sort of a grammar. It's a set of ideal type causal pathways that help us map causal connections between crises in multiple global systems today. And so I'm going to go through those in turn. In our stress trigger crisis model, a systemic crisis arises from the interaction of slow-moving stresses and fast-moving trigger events, which produce a crisis, which force a system out of its normal equilibrium and into a harmful state of disequilibrium. So this is a very distinctly systemic way of understanding crisis. It might be a bit counterintuitive, and it definitely needs a bit of unpacking here. So in this model, stresses are slow-moving processes that gradually, over years and decades, erode the resilience of a system as we know it. We can think of these stresses like pressures or like contradictions or vulnerabilities that really build up in a system over time and weaken its ability to recover from shocks. Triggers, in contrast, are much more fast-moving events that, in the scope of days and weeks, interact with those long-term stresses to push a system into crisis. So trigger events tend to be a lot more localized and unpredictable, whereas stresses are much larger scale processes that we can, to at least some extent, model and forecast. But to really understand this distinction, we have to think about what it means in reality. So in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, the trigger was really the transfer of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to humans. But that virus could only become the global pandemic it did because it interacted with several stresses that had been accumulating in health systems. And that includes the widening zones of contact or viral transmission between humans and unfamiliar animals. It includes the stress of the rapid global transportation networks that were able to spread the disease much faster than our monitoring systems could keep up with. And it interacted with the stress of the poor condition of many healthcare facilities, just the long-term underinvestment in healthcare pretty much across the world. But in our model, stresses and triggers interact to produce a very particular sort of crisis, what I've called here a systemic crisis, which occurs when a system is pushed out of its normal equilibrium and into a state of disequilibrium that creates significant harms. And we use a tool called a stability landscape diagram to really help visualize and explain this conception of systemic crisis. So if we can imagine, the x-axis metaphorically represents the full range of possible states the systems can take, the full range of its possible behaviors or configurations and properties. The y-axis represents the stability of a given system state, where lower positions have greater stability. And the green ball represents the system state at a given moment. So here we can see where the system is on the range of its possible states, that is the range of its possible configurations and behaviors, and we can kind of see how stable or unstable that particular state tends to be. Now, of course, the system's state fluctuates within the course of day-to-day events, but it normally remains within a particular equilibrium, represented here as a basin of attraction that draws the system towards its lowest point, even though that system never actually settles. This is what we call a dynamic equilibrium. It's a very ecological understanding of equilibrium. It's not the static equilibrium of economics. Here, that basin of attraction or that equilibrium is really comprised of these deep underlying feedbacks that help maintain familiar behaviors and qualities and functions within the system, even though that system is always in motion. Now, stresses, like those I pointed out in the pandemic context, shallow that basin of attraction so that it's very easy for some trigger event or other, such as a new virus, to push the system outside of its basin, that is, outside of equilibrium. And when that happens, the system enters a state of disequilibrium or crisis, where it's up on this very precarious hilltop, in which its behaviors are volatile and unpredictable, its functions are very much disrupted, and as a consequence, it starts hurting a lot of people. So signs of systemic disequilibrium in health systems during the pandemic included a surge of death and illness, distancing measures that very drastically disrupted everyday life, and emergency efforts to develop a vaccine. These were all indications of a health system outside of its normal equilibrium in a state of crisis with very, very devastating consequences. Now, the system might persist in disequilibrium for a while, but the crisis ultimately ends when the system returns to an equilibrium, whether it's by falling back into its old equilibrium or by moving into a new equilibrium, one with its own distinct set of feedbacks and behaviors and qualities. And so the COVID crisis could have pushed health systems into a new, more favorable equilibrium with better health services and high pandemic preparedness. Or that crisis could have actually pushed our health systems into some sort of major collapse equilibrium. But to the extent that we're actually through the pandemic, it seems that our health systems have returned to something really like the status quo that preceded the crisis, but now with even more stresses like healthcare worker burnout and funding problems, so that another health crisis remains actually quite likely. Now, while this STC or stress trigger crisis model deals with crisis in a single system, our polycrisis framework really looks at the way that these stresses, triggers, and crises in one system can relate to stresses, triggers, and crises in other systems. And so, as I mentioned earlier, our research really centers around what we call a grammar of ideal type relationships of these sorts of intersystemic causal interactions. And so I'm going to present to you first 4 ideal types of how these different systems might interrelate by their stresses, triggers, and crises. And then I'm going to show you 2 system mapping tools that we've used to analyze global polycrisis. So first, it's quite possible and perhaps common that a stress in one system causally interacts with a stress in a second system, which could then actually feed back and affect the stress in the first system. And this is a set of influences depicted in the blue arrow in the diagram here. So for example, insecurity in the food system, as a major stress in the food system, really forces poor people to devote a major portion of their income to food rather than education or investment or to enterprise. And the result is greater poverty and inequality in the economic system, so a major stress in the economic system. And that stress may then, by further lowering incomes, worsen food insecurity for the most vulnerable back in the food system. And in that way, we can see that these stresses are really interacting. We might also see what we call intersystemic stress trigger interactions, where a stress in one system can generate a trigger event in another system. So, for example, by disrupting habitats, climate heating in the environmental system increases that zone of contact between humans and unfamiliar animals, which increases the likelihood of a zoonotic viral transfer that then becomes a trigger in the health system. In that sense, warming in the environmental system as a major stress generates triggers in the forms of new viruses, zoonotic viruses in the health system. We can also see crisis impacts on adjacent systems, where a crisis in one system can affect the stresses and or triggers of another system. And as a key example here, the COVID-19 pandemic deepened the stress of socioeconomic inequality in the economic system, while aggressive fiscal responses by governments to the pandemic contributed to inflation in the economic system. And finally, we might see intersystemic crises interactions, where a crisis in one system interacts with a crisis in another system, altering the dynamics of both of those crises. And so a security crisis in the international system, say a major conflict, could worsen the climate crisis by diverting urgently needed attention and resources away from climate action, while that climate crisis can intensify an international security crisis by escalating conflicts over resources and perhaps by propelling mass migration. So in that way, crises in multiple systems can kind of form that vicious cycle and amplify one another. So I've presented these here as ideal type causal pathways or ideal type relationships by which stresses, triggers, and crises might interrelate across systems. And we can use these four pathways as conceptual building blocks for two different types of systems maps. One is what we call domino diagrams, which shows causal linkages that actually unfold over time across a timeline. And alternatively, we use what we call intersystemic feedback diagrams, which show simultaneous or cyclical patterns of causal loops. These are sort of ongoing and cyclical dynamics that don't necessarily follow a linear timeline. So here's an example of what we've developed I think, a year and a half ago as our kind of timeline of the present global polycrisis, just starting here with the pandemic. You'll note that the different shapes of the elements in these diagrams represent either a stress, a trigger, or a crisis. And we've used different colors to try and indicate which global system these stress, triggers, and crises are affecting. So just to start out here, you can see the stresses and the trigger event I noted earlier to produce the COVID-19 crisis. We can move forward in time up to the present, or maybe even a little further into the future with this segment of the map, which shows how the pandemic exacerbated several stresses in economic systems, such as labor shortages and loose credit, which interacted with trigger events like acute supply chain disruptions to produce global inflation, or what we better know today as the global cost of living crisis. And we can then add in the effects of climate change and even the Russia-Ukraine war and start speculating about some of the future knock-on effects of these causal interrelationships, knock-on effects that could lead to things like global financial crisis, maybe famines through multiple breadbasket failures, and perhaps highly escalated violent conflicts in the years ahead. So with domino diagrams, like I just showed you, you see there's a one-way causal relationship that operates in the direction of time. But of course, one system often affects another system in ways that feed back on the initial system, thereby creating an intersystemic feedback loop. And in this type of diagram, or those types of relationships, cause and effects travel through ongoing loops rather than along a timeline. And so I'm going to show you here a series of feedback diagrams that illustrate what we think are several very dangerous feedbacks that appear to be forming among systems today, and that we worry will spiral into a catastrophic future. So here in this first section of the diagram, economic turmoil creates opportunities for populist authoritarian leaders to gain power by taking advantage and stoking very nationalist, very chauvinistic, and very anti-globalist ideologies. Those sorts of ideologies, when they're translated into policies, worsen economic conditions and provide further openings for authoritarianism. This might sound a little familiar. In addition, populist authoritarian regimes tend to reduce their international cooperation, that is, their engagement in international organizations and cooperative venues, so that they can prioritize much more narrow, short-term self-interests, and that really reduces the benefits of global economic cooperation, adding further to economic turmoil and potential scarcities. And in the years ahead, faltering international cooperation could very easily undermine climate action, so that increasingly frequent and severe weather events drive a crisis of climate migration towards richer countries, which will likely deepen xenophobic ideologies in those receiving countries. And of course, that mounting economic turmoil and scarcity further contributes to processes of mass migration. And finally, those sorts of nationalistic, xenophobic reactions may precipitate violence against migrants or other minority communities, or just whoever happens to be scapegoated that particular day, while extreme weather events could trigger things like state collapse, civil war, and even international war. So violent conflicts also deepen the very nationalism that contributes to those violent conflicts, while generating even additional pressures for migration and worsening economic turmoil. So what we have here is basically a self-reinforcing group of problems, starting with economics and populist authoritarian, that spirals into these global issues of climate change exacerbating conflict, which is just further worsening those initial issues. Now, usually we tell you that this is, just one very scary scenario that we're kind of worried about, wherein polycrisis spirals into catastrophe. But again, we first published this over a year and a half ago, and it seems with the election of Trump, the relationships in this diagram are becoming less and less hypothetical and more real with every passing day. So it's a very scary scenario, and it's becoming less of a tail end sort of worry and more of a mainstream worry. But of course, tools like domino diagrams and these feedback diagrams, they help us understand the intersystemic connections that make up the polycrisis, and which could help escalate it in the near future. But the whole point of doing mapping exercises and causal tracing like this is ideally to help us avert and avoid such worst case scenarios like this one here. And so I think it's fair to say that we definitely need new strategies to address polycrisis, but we really have to start by asking, what does it mean to address polycrisis, right? It's a pretty vague formulation, but I think there are really three different goals that make up any part of a real global polycrisis strategy. And depending on which system we're talking about, it might that might determine which of these goals we focus on most. To avoid or prevent polycrises, we really need to reform global systems, especially those global systems that we generally like and want to continue. We need to reform them in ways that bolster their resilience so that they remain in stable and desirable equilibria. That is, so that they don't go into a systemic crisis that could then spread into other systems and push the world into undesirable new equilibria. to mitigate or to somehow limit the harm of polycrises that do occur, we need to really rethink and reconfigure some of the connections and interdependencies between global systems that enable crises to spread so quickly and so consequentially. So this would involve efforts of systems thinking and resilience building, like building buffers, creating fire breaks, promoting modularity, encouraging redundancies, diversities, experimentation, these sorts of strategies that are really about building more resilience into the connections or the network connecting different systems. And finally, to navigate through polycrises to better futures, we really need to transform quite a few of our systems, steering them away from very undesirable crisis-prone equilibria where they are today towards more beneficial and resilient equilibria that we might hope for tomorrow. And so these three goals really relate to the Janus-faced nature of crisis. Crisis as both harmful disaster, but also opportunity for transformational change. And I want to just turn back to those stability landscape diagrams quickly to show how our strategies might reflect this two-faced nature of crisis. So some global systems, like the liberal rules-based international order or democratic governance and the global democratic movement, have a generally desirable existing equilibrium, but those equilibria are losing resilience. In cases like that, our efforts should really strive to deepen the existing basin, that is to strengthen the existing equilibria. And we could do that by reforming those equilibria to address their many faults and improve them, but still remaining within an existing and desirable equilibria so that these crises don't move into much worse basins like global war and authoritarianism. So it's really about improving and reforming the resilience of an existing equilibrium here. But other global systems like the neoliberal economic order and the fossil fuel energy regime are really stuck in very undesirable equilibria today. These are resilient systems, but their equilibria is a harmful one. So in these cases, our strategies should really be to try and weaken the established equilibrium and deepen an alternative, more desirable equilibrium so that when a crisis occurs, as we can be pretty certain it will, we can actually transition to a more preferable basin of attraction, that is to a new equilibrium with as little harm as possible. It's about weakening the dysfunctional equilibrium, and in which, nonetheless is a very resilient equilibrium, and deepening an equilibrium that represents an alternative, a different way of structuring these systems that produces more desirable benefits and functionalities. But whatever strategy we sort of employ for particular systems, we really have to always be aware that what happens in one system creates opportunities and constraints for what can happen in other systems, so that any effective polycrisis response really has to center on these sorts of intersystemic trade-offs and hopefully some intersystemic synergies. And so I want to just conclude my presentation there. I know that's been a bit of a whirlwind overview of just how we're trying to think systemically about polycrisis at the Cascade Institute. Once again, I want to stress that our approach to polycrisis analysis is really just one of a huge range of different systemic approaches that are possible. We think it's highly productive, might turn out not to be the best or not to be entirely useful. We don't know, but it's certainly working for us right now. And I just want to mention that all of the approaches and ideas I've really rushed through in today's presentation are covered in a lot more detail and with a lot more rigor and with even more examples in these 3 publications, which are all available at cascadeinstitute.org. The first one is this Global Polycrisis article in the journal Global Sustainability, which is a very sort of technical statement of our approach to polycrisis. We also produced an internal sort of handbook to polycrisis analysis, which gives, I think, a bit more of a user-friendly and more concise presentation of our thinking, as well as some tips on how to use those domino diagrams and those intersystemic feedback diagrams that I presented earlier. And more recently, we've produced this report, Positive Pathways Through Polycrisis, where we look at different ways of thinking about systemic leverage, about tipping points, and about intersystemic connections in ways that hopefully give us ideas of how we might actually chart a way through crisis, how we might think about getting through crisis and building better systems for the future. And finally, as Sebastian mentioned quickly, if you're interested in polycrisis more generally, I just highly recommend that you visit polycrisis.org, which is a polycrisis learning and knowledge and networking hub that includes a resource library of polycrisis related materials. It includes a learning journey that goes through the development and the history of the polycrisis concept. And it also includes a community map of different individuals and organizations involved in the field of polycrisis research and action. So it's a really helpful tool there. And if you want to know just more about the Cascade Institute and our polycrisis program more broadly, you can just go to cascadeinstitute.org and find everything there. So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention to what was probably a very fast-paced and somewhat rushed presentation, but I look forward to hearing your reactions and your questions.
Well, thank you, Michael. There's probably panoplies of applause now on the other side of the screen. So I think we can take certainly questions from the floor, or even I think there's already some, I think from what I can see, just now written or in the chat. But if anyone has a question, I think maybe we can start it now. I think Paul, you had one, so I'll let you talk. Oh, and I get on the floor right after. Okay. Paul, can you? Edward, sorry. Can you? Ted, can you? Can we hear you?
Yes.
Excellent.
Can you hear me, Sebastian? Okay, excellent. Michael, thank you so much. My name is Ted Newman. I work here in the School of Politics and International Studies, and we launched a new MA program called Global Security Challenges this year. And one of the key conceptual themes I'm using in that is polycrisis. So we use your material a lot, and it's extremely useful. So it's great to meet you. One of the things I've been thinking about and discussing with students actually is in terms of, you know, the empirical understanding of polycrisis. And you spoke a lot about systems, system dynamics, which I think is really persuasive. But we could also think about non-linear dynamics, chaos theory, randomness, the idea that we may not be able to account for all of these compounding, overlapping interactions. So I was just wondering, at the Cascade Institute, in your discussions, you know, how seriously do you take the prospect of chaos theory and non-linear dynamics in your analysis of this subject? Thank you.
Great. That's a great question. Can I start there? Is that okay? Great. Yeah. So yeah, nonlinear dynamics. We certainly are concerned with linear dynamics, and I think it's important always to stress um, that nonlinear dynamics or nonlinear, the term, it means a whole wealth of things. As one mathematician put it, talking about nonlinear dynamics is really like talking about non-elephant animals, right? It's such a huge range. So, I mean, for us, this idea of the stability landscapes of equilibrium and disequilibrium, that is one instance of nonlinear dynamics that we're concentrating on, and it obviously relates to the broader tipping points debate. But in terms of chaos theory, we don't necessarily have any direct engagement with chaos theory, and it's not entirely randomness, but it's really about sensitivity to initial conditions. But I think what we'd emphasize is that when these systems go out of equilibrium, when those feedbacks that are sort of maintaining them within familiar patterns, when those are suddenly somehow disabled and other forces start taking over, that's when you start seeing chaotic states where the system is just being pushed this way and that way and just moving in apparently random patterns. And almost all you can hope for is that it'll eventually fall back in or fall into an equilibrium that gives you some more regularity, some predictability, and hopefully better outcomes. So I think chaotic behaviors would be a sort of a characteristic of a system in a state of disequilibrium. But as you correctly imply here, that means that when they are in crisis, it's almost impossible to chart exactly where they're going to go. I mean, we see this daily in the headlines too. I think it's safe to say that the world geopolitical system, or the system of world order, it's out of equilibrium. We've left that liberal international order that's really served much of the world, albeit with immense inequalities and a lot of problems, but generally well for the last 70 years. We're outside that equilibrium, and from day to day, we just don't know what's going to happen, whether Trump's suddenly going to abandon Ukraine and make a huge rapprochement with Putin. I didn't see that coming, or whether what the tariffs are going to be, if we just suddenly see the liberal trade regime just fall out, whether we return overnight to some sort of system of territorial conquest and maybe resistance to that. This is a pretty chaotic time, right? And so I think these are cases where you see that kind of chaotic unpredictability in the system as part of that crisis period, as an indication of that crisis. But of course, it doesn't boil down just to the actions of one particularly inept individual. It's that individual acting in the context of these very complex interdependent systems, so that one action here is producing 10,000 unpredicted consequences over here that are just beyond people's control and often beyond our ability to immediately grasp. And so I think that is really a key part of the challenge. As Robert Jervis, I think it was, put it with complex systems, the challenge is that we can never ever do just one thing. Every action that we have has multiple consequences, some foreseen, some unforeseen, and that's why these crises often do display that sort of chaotic character that I think you highlighted. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's kind of where, for me, chaos fits into this framework. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So we have questions from the floor. I don't know. Shall we?
Yes.
Can you hear? Just because I think there's a microphone there, but can you hear the question now?
I might try and ask it, and I might get you to repeat it.
Okay.
So I was just wondering how, or if you kind of call it sort of strategy and game theory within your sort of framework. So thinking about like the solutions that you put, you have like avoid and mitigate as like potential sort of actions you can take with the solution. But there sometimes might be trade-offs between an avoid and a mitigate. So for example, if you're looking at international security. You could have a treaty with something like NATO, for example, so you could increase the, I guess, size and strength of that, which might contribute to the kind of a void. But then, if there is some kind of conflict, that then may be, bring more actors into the conflict than otherwise would have been. So yeah, wondering if that's something that you've kind of accounted for in your framework, how there might be trade-offs to those sort of solution types.
Was this clear or not?
I think I caught half of that. I think the question was about using game theoretic and rational choices to understand security crises like the war in the Ukraine, but I didn't quite catch what the trade-offs were here.
Well,
Maybe there's a microphone here. I mean, you can get So that.
So in the kind of the solutions framework you had an avoid and a mitigate as like potential forms a solution could take, but there could be trade-offs between an avoid and a mitigate. So for example, as in strengthening a military alliance could lead to avoid because you may prevent conflict ever occurring, but in case it does occur, you've brought in potentially more actors and you've made the crisis worse maybe than it otherwise might have been. So I was wondering how that's accounted for in the framework.
Yeah. Okay. I think I see the essence of the question here. The sort of trade-offs between those three different types of solutions I talked about: the prevention, the mitigation, and the sort of the navigation. And you're right; they don't always go together. Sometimes, efforts to mitigate or deepen a particular equilibrium could have consequences that interfere with our ability to mitigate crisis spread. Might mean that we aren't able to build things like modularity and fire breaks. These would be sort of situations when, say, facing regional or local food crises, for example, our tendency is to basically ramp up the industrial food production system and the food trade system to compensate, to better distribute food, to get it to where it needs to go in the means of crises. That helps us respond to a particular crisis in the food system, but it also creates deeper vulnerabilities in that sort of globally networked industrial based system has a lot of inherent systemic risks. And as you double down on it, you're also exacerbating those potential risks that help you mitigate crisis spread. That might not be the best, clearest off the cuff example there, but yeah, I think you're quite right that there are some hard trade-offs often between how we approach these sorts of things. And one of those trade-offs I just want to highlight too is just things that we do to improve conditions in one system may create harms in another system. So to the extent that we want to expand food production for a growing population, the harm there, like, that's great. We want to feed people. We want more food. We want it more equitably distributed. But there might be trade-offs in terms of having to convert more lands from their sort of native ecological systems into food production areas, or there might be trade-offs in deepening fossil fuel dependence because those particular methods of food production are so dependent on fossil fuels. So I hope that kind of begins to offer a bit of an answer there, if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We had another question as well. So,
when you employ the concept of system, is there a particular school of thinking around systems that you have in mind? Presumably, it's going to be a synthesis of a whole range of voices, because of course there are so many from different disciplinary backgrounds. But I was just curious about whether there was a particular idiom of system conceptuality that you're appealing to, and also how it kind of relates, how you position your application of the concept to previous generations of theorizing through the concept of system that obviously go back to the 1950s and so on. Is there a particular modification, or how do you position or style your language of system in relation to earlier waves, and are there particular names or schools or authorities that you're particularly deploying or making use of?
Mhm. Yep, that's a great question. You're right. As I mentioned, there's a whole range of different systems approaches. For me, like I've obviously dabbled in a lot of them, but I'd say for this sort of project, we're really starting from the work of Donella Meadows. That's really been the most useful inroad, the one that we've recommended to a lot of people as how to think about these sorts of things. And in that, it's a systems dynamic model, but also it's about causal loop diagrams and looking at systems through their feedbacks. And so she provides, it's a system is basically a collection of things with dense interconnections that produce novel aggregate level behaviors and properties. Very simple start for what a system is. But from there, you can start looking at causal feedbacks that produce those aggregate level phenomenon, and that start and start creating feedbacks between different components of a system that generate particular behaviors and things like that. So that's definitely the starting point there. We're not using systems dynamics in the sense of differential equations forming a mathematical system in a computer simulation model. Ours is a much more qualitative approach based in those causal loop diagrams, but in many cases where you do have the data, you can start with those causal loop diagrams and start building those kinds of models. We're definitely different in terms of systems thinking than classical economics, if anyone, or classical IR. These are classical, I don't want to dismiss these disciplines, but just the neoclassical economics and sort of the old school realist versus neoliberal thinking in IR. They have very, very static, very, very shallow, and very, very underdeveloped ideas about what systems are. So we're definitely trying to overcome and avoid those things. That's kind of why I was trying to emphasize that we're talking about these dynamic equilibriums that are much more akin to systems thinking in ecology, not the sort of status, or static. This is where supply meets demand. There's price. There's equilibrium. Definitely not that kind of approach. So we differentiate ourselves from that. But I think it's also it might be important to stress a lot of people come to systems thinking through Niklas Luhmann, which is a very different approach to systems thinking, which is really about systems of communication. And personally, I found that approach intriguing, but not satisfactory for understanding Polycrisis because it's really about communication. It's not really rooted in things like the material world. There's not much of an interface between sort of the social and the physical, and so it seems to miss a lot of these dynamics. But that said, Luhmann is tricky, so that might just be the fact that I haven't dug in far enough there. So there might be some resonances there yet. So who knows? But I think overall, our system is based in complex systems thinking, but that's a really, really big tent that draws from sustainability and ecology, like in those stability landscape diagrams we talked about, causal loop diagramming, non-linear thinking, tipping points, all these sorts of things. So we're kind of in that broad eclectic camp without trying to necessarily put up walls or sort of limit ourselves artificially. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Meadows.
Yeah, Daniela Meadows. Is it this?
Donella Meadows was one of the people behind the limits to growth model back in the early 1970s. She passed away I think almost 2 decades ago, but her key book. Her key book is Thinking in Systems. I guess you can't quite see this because of the blurry thing, but Donella Meadows, Thinking in Systems, a primer. I mean, if you're teaching courses, if you're new to systems thinking, that's why I generally recommend people start. day one of my courses, that there's a piece for Meadows in there. So hopefully that helps.
All right. I suppose there's no other question. Do we have a question from the audience? Okay, there's maybe a question in the chat. So, do you have time, Michael, or do you want to come and read it here? I don't know, or I give you the microphone. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right, here. Sorry, the chat here. Okay, well, I can read it actually. Yeah, sorry. So, hi, Michael. Fantastic talk. This is from Ines, I think. Is it this? As someone not familiar with the field, thank you for explaining some complex concept in such clarity. I have I have a long question about political viewpoint. It seems. Wait a minute. Okay, it seems the understanding of polycrisis is undisputedly necessary for a global future, but is also based and will be labeled by others as boot and liberal left values. And those system in crisis becomes, however, largely governed by populist groups for whom there is an increasing voter base. How can we best use or communicate this approach without entrenching further societal divisions? Is there any way populist leaders would find value in any of this, even if their core values won't change? Or must the work happen outside of those institutions? I hope that makes sense. Looking for some hope here. Thank you.
I'll do my best with that. I think I'd be curious to hear more about how you feel it's rooted in liberal or left values. But in my presentation, I did suggest that liberal democracy and the liberal international order, for me, those are favorable systems that we need to strengthen and re-strengthen. But of course, a lot of people would disagree. So that's, I think, a key point where the normativity comes in this. There's a political debate about, which systems do we want to maintain and which systems do we really want to reform? Some people really want to maintain a fossil fuel dependent regime or market-based liberal economic arrangements. Others don't. And so there's necessarily a political conflict in here. In today's political climate, there's a worry that if you're talking about complex systems, or if you're talking about how issues are actually very, very complicated, you're readily dismissed because there's, I think, a political climate that's right now favoring very simple answers and very simple, actionable solutions that just aren't going to work, right? The more stressed we become as individuals, as societies, the more we tend to turn to simplified answers, to very clear courses of action, even if those are entirely misguided. And so that's one of the challenges that we face right now is we're increasingly stressed under a crisis that tends to bias our thinking towards easy solutions, but we always have to keep the bigger picture in mind. And in terms of how populist leaders might think about this sort of framework, I think leaders like Trump, like Orban, others around the world, they're really great at shallowing that basin of attraction, right? They know how to very quickly undermine the resilience of a democratic system by basically pushing out information to the point where nobody knows what to believe anymore, by making sure that political institutions are jammed up and at loggerheads, so people are just frustrated with the lack of efficacy, by just dismantling the sort of legal norms and feedbacks that make the system work and prevent abuses of power. They probably don't see it in these terms because these are complicated terms with lots of syllables, but they do know exactly how to shallow that basin of attraction, how to undermine the resilience of things like a democratic system or a liberal international order. And they're building adjacently a much deeper basin, a basin that we might travel to, which would be a sort of authoritarian equilibrium. We can see that in the US right now. Everything that Trump is doing is just basically shallowing that that basin of traditional American institutional-based democracy and using that Project 2025 playbook to produce an adjacent authoritarian basin of attraction. And he's doing all that he can to see that that system, that ball, moves from that shallow democratic basin into that authoritarian basin. And it might just be a major crisis, like a big influx of refugees, or maybe a terrorist attack that serves as a trigger event that allows him to do that finally. And so I guess I'm not sure if that was exactly what you implied with this question, but that's how we might think about authoritarian strategies using the language that I presented here and the system framework that I presented here. So apologies, I don't think that's a very hopeful answer there, but it's maybe something.
Oh, thanks very much, Michael. Is anything else, or are we're fine? I think. Michael, I mean, I had maybe a small point of reflection. But I was thinking, maybe drawing back a bit on what Olivier was talking about, polycrisis being a problem, a crisis of organization.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering whether, and that's completely a different ontological perspective, but whether polycrisis is not also a crisis of systemic thought in some ways, because of the ontological assumptions that is made about the agency of those systems and the way in which they interrelate specific form of processes. That maybe allows us to have paying a lot of attention on certain dynamics or identified dynamics within those systems, but that we don't that do not take into account other elements at the micro perspective, because obviously when you write from a perspective, understand it from a wider global view on crisis. But often, they would emerge from the micro-political perspective, and I think the systemic perspective that is provided to us is a bit more interested in the macro element that fits relatively well within critical theory from the Frankfurt School and so on. So, I'm just thinking, is it not also a challenge to think crisis through systemic thought in some ways that is also calling on us? And it's not at all discrediting what you're saying, but just to say that it is something that it opens up even more discussions on how to engage with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely fair. And just to get back to one of the points I tried to make right at the beginning is that part of this whole talk about polycrisis, the reason that people like us we see this word and we're like, okay, I think there's something there, is that we're just not satisfied with old ways of thinking, right? We just the ways that things have been done in the past are just not capturing what's going on, or not adequately tailored to what's going on. And part of that is definitely a sort of institutional organizational dimension, in that every global system you have, the way that we approach it, we'd like to think about it as, there's a set of institutions, there's a set of worldviews, and there's a set of technologies, and that sort of forms a sort of cohesive whole. And you can't really change those systems unless you consider all those different aspects. So we kind of think about institutions and technologies and worldviews as almost the meta systems that animate, or that are really sustaining those 8 global systems that we've tended to focus on more in our polycrisis work, and look at causal connections and interactions among.
No, it makes sense. It was just picking, a bit in the shadow that was interested in. Yeah. Well, on this, Michael, thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. You could see the comments. People were delighted to have you here, and also to get your talk. We're gonna be in touch. I'm gonna send an email, and let's see where the ball's going. But congratulations, thank you for your talk, and hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Hope to meet you in person one day. Cheers.
Excellent. Cheers. Bye bye.